Imagine waking up one morning to find the world's balance of power flipped on its head. For decades, America sat confidently at the top, holding the dollar as its golden key and Europe as its closest ally. But today, a new power triangle is emerging: India, China, and Russia, quietly building an alliance that could rewrite the rules of global politics. This isn't just another diplomatic handshake. It's a calculated move that strikes at the very heart of America's economic engine, the dollar. And if history has taught us anything, it's that empires rarely collapse with a loud bang. They crumble slowly, piece by piece, until one day the foundation gives way. We're now witnessing the early tremors of that shift. Trade deals bypassing the dollar. Strategic partnerships once thought impossible now being sealed with a smile. And while Washington debates policy, the rest of the world is redrawing the map. For Europe, the consequences could be even more devastating: an economic slowdown turning into a political crisis as its reliance on U.S.-led strategies leaves it exposed in a changing world. The question is no longer whether this alliance can challenge the West, it's how quickly it can turn the tables. And if America doesn't adapt, it may soon find itself playing catch up in a game it once controlled. The storm is gathering. The dollar's supremacy is under fire. And the world's geopolitical order may never look the same again. For decades, the United States has relied on a simple but powerful truth. The dollar is not just America's currency, it is the world's currency. Every oil deal, every international loan, every major trade agreement, most of them were priced and settled in dollars. This gave the United States an unparalleled advantage, not just economically but politically. If a nation opposed Washington, sanctions could be enforced with the stroke of a pen, because without access to the dollar system, their economy would suffocate. This was more than financial dominance. It was a tool of global influence, a silent lever that kept much of the world in line. But what happens when nations start questioning the very foundation of that power? What happens when major economies, each powerful in their own right, begin to see the dollar not as an unquestionable standard, but as a political weapon they would rather avoid? That's exactly what we're witnessing now. India, China, and Russia, three nations with very different histories and agendas, are finding common ground in a shared goal: reducing their dependency on the US dollar. And the shift is not theoretical, it's happening in real transactions, in trade deals, in the quiet signing of agreements that most people don't hear about until years later. Russia, cut off from the Western banking system due to sanctions, has been forced to innovate, turning to the yuan and the rupee for trade. China, long wary of America's ability to choke its economy through the dollar, has been building parallel payment systems and promoting its own currency internationally. And India, while balancing its relationships with both East and West, sees the strategic advantage of settling certain trades outside the dollar, especially with partners who are also looking for ways to bypass Western pressure. The psychology behind this shift is as important as the economics. For decades, the dollar represented stability and trust. But now, in the eyes of many, it represents control that can be used against them at any moment. And once trust erodes, it is incredibly difficult to rebuild. The more nations realize they can survive, even thrive, without the dollar, the more momentum this movement will gain. This isn't just a matter of economics, it's a matter of sovereignty. When a nation can trade, invest, and develop without relying on a currency controlled by another government, it gains a degree of freedom that no foreign policy promise can match. The United States still holds incredible influence, but influence without unquestioned trust is fragile. The dollar's dominance has been one of America's greatest strengths, but like all strengths, it becomes a vulnerability if taken for granted. What we're seeing is not the end of the dollar overnight, but the slow building of a world where the dollar is simply one currency among many, no longer the single pillar holding up global trade. And once that shift reaches critical mass, there's no reversing it. The lesson here is simple: power is never permanent, and trust is never infinite. If you fail to protect both, you will eventually lose them. One of the most dangerous mistakes any superpower can make is to assume that alliances are fixed, that geopolitical loyalties are written in stone. History tells us the opposite. Alliances shift, sometimes slowly, sometimes overnight, depending on interests, threats, and opportunities. For decades, American foreign policy operated on the assumption that India could be drawn permanently into the Western orbit, primarily as a counterbalance to China. But reality is proving far more complex. India is not a passive player waiting to be led. It is a civilization, state with thousands of years of history, a deep cultural memory, and a growing sense of strategic self-confidence. While Washington often frames alliances through ideological lenses, democracy versus authoritarianism, India approaches them through a far more pragmatic lens, national interest. And when national interest demands cooperation with nations outside the Western Bloc, it will act accordingly. The recent deepening of India's ties with both Russia and China, even amid its border tensions with Beijing, demonstrates a nuanced approach. On one hand, India continues to engage with the United States in areas like defense cooperation, technology exchange, and trade. On the other, it refuses to sever its long-standing relationship with Russia, a key supplier of energy and military hardware. For New Delhi, this is not hypocrisy, it is balance. It is the recognition that survival and progress in an unpredictable world require flexibility, not blind loyalty. China, too, understands the value of engaging India, even if the relationship is competitive. Shared participation in forums like BRICS provides a platform for dialogue and economic cooperation that sidesteps Western dominance. The very existence of such platforms signals to the world that multipolarity is no longer just an idea. It is an emerging reality. And in that reality, the United States is just one of several power centers, not the sole leader of the global order. From a psychological perspective, this is a direct challenge to the American mindset. The U.S. is accustomed to a world in which countries choose sides, ours or theirs, and remain committed to that choice. But India's strategic behavior reflects a more fluid, transactional understanding of global politics. It aligns on some issues, diverges on others, and refuses to be boxed into a single camp. This is not betrayal, it is sovereignty in action. For Washington, the real danger lies in misreading this shift. If U.S. policymakers continue to see India only as a partner to be one against China, they will miss the larger truth. India is carving its own path, one that will sometimes align with American interests and sometimes not. That independence is exactly what makes India valuable to other rising powers, and exactly what makes it less predictable for the United States. In a world where the old order is fading, influence is not about locking nations into alliances, it's about staying relevant to their interests. And if America fails to adapt to this new diplomatic reality, it risks pushing India further into the embrace of those building an alternative system. The takeaway is clear. You cannot dictate the choices of a sovereign nation. You can only make yourself indispensable to its future. Lose that position, and you will lose the relationship. If there is one reality that many in the West still underestimate, it is the scale and speed of the dollar's decline as the central pillar of the global economy. For nearly 8 decades, the US dollar has functioned not only as a currency, but as a symbol of American dominance. It has been the medium of global trade, the reserve currency for central banks, and the benchmark against which value is measured. This dominance gave Washington a unique and potent tool, the ability to project power without deploying a single soldier. Through the control of the global financial system, SWIFT, IMF lending conditions, sanctions mechanisms, the United States could punish enemies, pressure allies, and maintain its strategic advantage. But the world is changing, and with it, the dollar's unchallenged position. The rise of parallel systems, BRICS initiatives to create alternative payment mechanisms, currency swap agreements, and the push for trade in national currencies is more than just economic experimentation. It is an act of geopolitical defiance. When India and Russia trade energy in rupees, or when China and Brazil settle transactions in yuan, they are not simply bypassing the dollar. They are eroding the very foundation of America's leverage. This shift is not sudden. It is incremental, like water wearing away stone. Yet over time, it is transformative. Once a significant portion of world trade no longer requires the dollar, the demand for it decreases. That means less global reliance on U.S. debt, fewer foreign reserves held in American currency, and ultimately, less ability for Washington to finance its power projection without painful domestic consequences. From a psychological standpoint, this is also a blow to perception. The dollar's supremacy has been as much about trust and stability as it has been about economics. If nations begin to perceive the United States as a less reliable or less dominant force, that perception alone accelerates the shift. Confidence is fragile. Once shaken, it rarely returns to its original state. The consequences for Europe in this scenario are equally profound. Much of the European Union's stability rests on its economic integration with the US-led order. A weakened dollar doesn't just mean a stronger yuan or ruble. It means the gradual fracturing of the Western economic bloc. Europe, already strained by internal divisions and energy dependencies, will find itself caught between an America struggling to retain influence and a rising Eurasian economic sphere offering alternative partnerships. The phrase, "death of Europe," may sound dramatic, but in geopolitical terms it could mean the loss of economic autonomy and strategic relevance on the world stage. This is why the current moves by India, China, and Russia matter so deeply. They are not isolated acts, they are coordinated steps in the construction of a world where the dollar is no longer the center. And once the center shifts, the entire balance of global power shifts with it. If America fails to recognize this moment as a turning point, it risks waking up to a reality where it is no longer setting the rules, but simply playing by someone else's. That is the real danger, not just losing a currency's dominance, but losing the leverage that dominance once gave. There is a principle in geopolitics that often goes unspoken but governs the rise and fall of nations. Isolation is fatal. No matter how powerful a country appears, the moment it begins to alienate allies and misread the shifting balance of power, it starts to decay from within. What we are witnessing now with the deepening cooperation between India, China, and Russia is not just an alliance of convenience. It is the formation of an alternative world order. And the United States, through a mixture of arrogance, short-term thinking, and a failure to adapt, has positioned itself on the wrong side of that historical shift. These nations are not coming together out of mere friendship. They are bound by shared strategic interests. Each of them has experienced the weight of Western dominance, whether through economic pressure, diplomatic double standards, or military encirclement. For Russia, it is the sanctions and NATO's eastward expansion. For China, it is the technology restrictions, the trade wars, and the constant military presence in its maritime backyard. For India, it is the subtle but persistent recognition that Western partnerships rarely deliver on promises when they conflict with the West's own priorities. When such grievances align, the result is a convergence of purpose. What is most striking is that this emerging bloc is not simply reacting to American policies. It is actively building structures to bypass American influence entirely. Alternative financial systems, joint energy projects, shared military exercises, and technology collaborations are laying the groundwork for a parallel system of global governance. This is not rebellion in the traditional sense. It is a slow but deliberate withdrawal from dependence on Western systems, combined with the creation of self-sustaining alternatives. And once those alternatives reach critical mass, reversing the trend becomes almost impossible. From a psychological perspective, the American establishment still views power in terms of direct confrontation, military might, economic sanctions, and diplomatic pressure. But the new form of power being exercised here is more subtle. It is about resilience and redundancy. If you cannot be cut off from vital resources, if you can finance your projects without the dollar, if you can secure your borders without relying on Western defense pacts, then the threat of isolation loses its teeth. That shift changes the rules of the game entirely. The tragedy is that much of this could have been avoided. Strategic humility, recognizing that the world would inevitably become multipolar, could have allowed the United States to adapt and position itself as a cooperative leader rather than a defensive hegemon. Instead, missteps and miscalculations have accelerated the very process they sought to prevent. And now, as the lines of this new geopolitical map are being drawn, the question is no longer whether this coalition will shape the future, but how far it will go in redefining the global order. When nations stop asking for your approval and start building a system where your approval is irrelevant, you are no longer leading. You are chasing. And history has little mercy for those who arrive late to the future. If there's one truth history teaches us, it's that no empire, no currency, no alliance lasts forever. Power is not a trophy you win and keep. It's a flame you must continually tend, or it flickers and dies. The United States, Europe, and indeed every nation listening to this unfolding story must grasp that the world is not fixed. It is alive, breathing, and always changing. The nations that endure are those that anticipate the change and adapt before it arrives, not after it strikes. For leaders, the advice is simple, but rarely followed. Listen more than you speak, observe more than you react, and measure your strength not just by the weapons you wield, but by the trust you inspire. A strong nation is one whose allies stay not because they are afraid to leave, but because they truly want to stay. That requires honesty in diplomacy, fairness in trade, and humility in leadership. If you rule by intimidation, you might control the present, but you will never secure the future. For citizens, the lesson is equally urgent. Do not be a passive spectator in your own era. The collapse of a currency, the reshaping of alliances, the rise of new powers, these are not abstract events happening in far-off rooms. They shape the price of your food, the value of your savings, the stability of your job, and the safety of your children. Learn how the world works. Read widely, think critically, and refuse to be lulled into complacency by comforting narratives. A population that understands the stakes is far harder to mislead or manipulate. For emerging powers, the temptation will be to mimic the very mistakes of the West. Hubris, overreach, and the belief that dominance is the ultimate goal. Resist that. True power is not the ability to dictate terms, but to create a world in which your strength is respected without fear and your influence is sought without coercion. If India, China, and Russia, or any nation rising today, forget this, they will merely trade one failing empire for another in a different flag. And for all of us, whether in government offices or ordinary homes, the deepest advice is this: the world thrives when cooperation outweighs confrontation, when dialogue replaces threats, and when competition is channeled into progress rather than destruction. Multipolarity does not have to mean fragmentation. It can mean a richer, more balanced world if we have the wisdom to approach it with foresight instead of ego. The storms ahead are real: economic tremors, shifting currencies, fragile alliances. But storms do not only destroy, they also reveal who built their foundations on sand and who built on rock. The time to strengthen those foundations, politically, economically, morally, is now. Because when history's tide rises, you cannot stop it. You can only decide whether you will be swept away or carried forward. And that choice, though it belongs to nations, begins with the will of individuals.